All right, welcome to our new Urban Hope podcast. My name is Katie, and this is your place for encouragement and conversation about the unique ways God is at work in the cities of Europe. We are so excited about our conversation today.
Hello, everyone, and today we want to talk about cultural diversity in our European cities. Cities with so many different ethnicities. We want to talk about Christians in migrant churches, about intercultural togetherness and collaboration in our churches, and how we can better deal with each other in our cities. My name is Rainer Schacke, and our guest today is Usha Reifsnider. Welcome, Usha.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Usha, let me briefly try to introduce you. It's so much in your biography, but what I've found is you are a British cultural anthropologist and a practical theologian with a Hindu background. You have served in cross-cultural missions since 1988 with a specific focus on migrant engagement. And you did your PhD at the Oxford Centre of Mission Studies, correct?
It is, yes. All that is true.
And you serve as a Lausanne Europe Regional Director and on the board of the European Evangelical Alliance. And you are also a director at the Center of Missionaries from the Majority World. Correct?
It is indeed. Sounds quite impressive when you say it all together.
It sounds so impressive. And with all your expertise, theology also has something to do with biography. Where did it all begin for you? How did you come into contact with the Christian faith with your Hindu background?
I like that question. I like the way you phrased it, that theology is with biography, because really theology is through a lived experience. And so my interaction with Christianity came as the child of a migrant. My parents didn't speak English. We lived in a very poor part of Britain. And I first came into contact with Christianity through a school teacher who was very kind to us and invited us to something called Sunday school. And that was my first glimpse of Christianity and Christians.
Great. Do you want to give us a little bit more insight in that part of your life?
Sure. I'm the second oldest of 5 children. And when my dad left India, he left my mum pregnant with my big sister. And he came to Britain to work in the factories because there was a shortage of labour. There was no equal pay for migrants and nationals, for whites and non-whites. And so my father earned the wages of a 14-year-old boy. There was no rent control, so people charged triple the rent. And so it took my father 6 years to save money to get my mum to come to England with my big sister. And then the following year I was born. And I went to school and I didn't speak any English because in my home we spoke Gujarati. And on the first day of school, my sister was holding my hand and she said, "Repeat after me. Yes, Mrs. Aston. No, Mrs. Aston. Thank you very much, Mrs. Aston." So that was all the English I knew. And if anyone spoke to me, that's all I said for the first few days. And it worked. And so I adapted to the culture of a little infant school, a primary school in the West Midlands in England. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for our own family. There was no understanding of migrant culture. We're still going on the coattails of the days of colonialism. India had not long had independence. So there was a lot of racism, really. But we didn't discuss it at home. We found kind Christians. We had lovely, kind Christian neighbours who lived amongst us and with us in a way that was very caring. And so I was drawn to Christianity from multiple different sides, really.
Can you tell us more about your experience then entering into that Sunday school class or that church context? Did they have an understanding of your background, or were there others like you?
No, they had no understanding of my background whatsoever. But they taught us songs like Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. That was good theology. That was good theology. And there were no experts on Hinduism. And incidentally, by the time I was about 10 or 11, they were beginning to build Hindu temples in our city. Even prior to that, at the weekends, often on Fridays and Saturdays, because my family were temple musicians in India, we used to travel from town to town, doing sort of what we call bhajan, which are like worship services for special holidays. But I would go to church on Sundays. And fortunately, this is very fortunate, nobody at the church ever said to me, don't go to the Hindu ceremonies. Because if they had have said that, I would have stopped going to church. Instead, what they did was they taught me what they knew. They taught me the Bible, and they loved me in the best way that they knew how.
Wow. And is that something you recommend to churches to this day? Or was that unique to your experience at that moment in time?
No, I think I would still recommend that to people today. I don't care, or I don't believe there's any difference between people of any religion. No one wants to be argued with. And very few people are won by argument, in actual fact. And so I would say spend more time learning about that person than telling them about you, because who you are as a follower of Christ will show. I mean, there's something about Sunday school theology, that little light of yours will shine. If the creator of the universe, we believe, is living inside of us, then part of that revelation, that revealing, that view is the life, the day-to-day lived theology of a follower of Jesus.
Wow, that's great insight. And I think it takes a lot of pressure off people to feel like they need to say the right thing or point out flaws in other people's theology, but to trust the Spirit of God at work within us. But I'm curious to hear more. What was your family's experience like as you were going to this church? Were they with you? What did they think of you attending this local church?
They actually thought it was wonderful. I mean, I remember when this school teacher, her name was Joyce, when she came and she said to my older sister, would you like to go to Sunday school? And I remember my big sister asking my mom, and my mom was thrilled. She was absolutely thrilled because he was a white woman who took interest in us, and she was a school teacher, and she wanted to take us to her place of worship. So we felt deeply honored.
Let's take a look at the big picture. Coming from there, what role does cultural identity play in shaping the sense of belonging of people in a big multicultural city?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about just all religions and all faith expressions, I think what creates cultural belonging is overlap. So we look for the places of overlap. I mean, we all have to eat. We all have to sleep. We all have to take our children to school. We all have to pay our bills. We all have to work. Somewhere in all of those things that we have to do, the trajectories of different people cross and overlap. So we start off with looking at the things that we do that are the same.
Yeah. How do immigrant communities deal with the tension between preserving their cultural heritage and adapting to the culture of their contemporary city?
It's a good question. A lot of people, it seems to me, in host countries, make the assumption that immigrants don't want to be like them. Okay? In my experience, the only time I don't want to be like the people of my host country is when I see the rudeness. Okay, so I've lived in countries outside of Britain. I've lived in different parts of the world. And in some of the countries that I've been to, outside of the West, the darker you are, the worse people treat you. And so I'm never going to be able to stop looking the way I look. So in order to protect my children from that, I give them the value from home. And I also make it almost heroic, the place that we left home, because it's better than the pain of mistreatment by hosts. And so I'm not saying that everyone has that, but when you have diminishing or too few positive images of people who look like you, whether it's television, society, statistics, politicians, it rubs off on the host country and they look at us with those eyes and we can feel it. We can feel it. And it makes us want to hold on to something of value, to give ourselves and our children some value. Now, this, of course, changes over time because relationships break down stereotypes. Any relationship that you're in long enough, you'll see the individual beyond the template.
So help us understand, in light of what you just shared in this question of looking at the city, your own experience and looking at the city broadly, and migrants recently, those who've moved there and they consider that city their host city, and the differences maybe are so, like you said, there's overlap, but there's also differences. How do you form relationships in that overlap? How do you go from just being in the same place at the same time or having the same rhythms to actually being in relationship with people who look very different and have very different stories?
Migrants are fully aware that they look different. They can't help that. They're fully, I mean, I can, when people arrive in even in Oxford, I can walk around and spot people who've just arrived. I can tell their body language. So I can spot Americans especially. The body language is different. When they've been here a few months, their body language changes. But when you think of what a migrant, the loneliness that they feel, all of their hope is in the younger generation. So if you reach out to young mothers who are taking their children to school, the difference that makes is incredible. Because migrants will educate their children at any cost. They'll go without, the adults will go without whatever, the education of their children, and people honoring their desire and working alongside them goes a long way. So I think probably children is one of the biggest areas. And I see, on social media, of course, I look at everything in English, and especially this time of year, I see all the British, American, because that's where my friends are, children posting about the stress they feel of sending their child to their first day of school. I'm thinking, yeah, you've had them in your home, in your country all this time. Can you imagine if you arrived in the country 2 weeks ago or a year ago? Can you imagine what it's like just leaving your child at a door, turning on the television and seeing what people think of people that look like you, and then having to walk away from that school gate? Can you imagine what that could be like?
Wow. Having you paint that picture is so significant just in that one moment, to think of the empathy that evoked in me as you painted that picture. How can churches really help others develop that empathy, like you just described that experience? How can churches who have a heart for the migrant and immigrant communities, how can they teach and train their people to see things that way?
I think, I lived in the US for 20 years, so I have some experience of living outside of Europe. I think it's especially difficult in the US because you don't have a pedestrian culture. You don't walk to the shops and see your neighbors. There's very few places where you just interact with people that don't look like you. I think I was living in our home in Florida for 5 years before my next door neighbor opened the door. I would leave gifts for her every year at Christmas. She would open the curtain, wait till I left, and then open the door and get the gift. Because you don't have that culture of just being around people. Now, in the churches in the US, people go to church miles from their neighborhood, right? They go to a church that they have to drive 4, 5, 10, 20 miles to. And they only relate to those people on Sunday. So even with their own people group, they don't have a habit of interaction. And so, churches try, they have things like home groups and cell groups and things like that. But the basic architectural structure of our cities is not conducive to relationship. It actually, American cities specifically, I feel as if they're built in a way that makes consumerism more important. You can't survive without a car or even 2 cars. You can't, there isn't a walking distance to a shop. Now, if you come from the majority world, you're like, hey, I'll get on a bus. There isn't even a bus system. And so we have to actually ask about how our cities are constructed. Now, that's a big ask because you're like, hey, I'm just an ordinary church. I'm a person sitting in a pew. But we have to think about these things as well. What is it that we want out of life? Right? We all have
what
our
I hear
priorities.
you saying is actually really encouraging to think about the cities of Europe and the natural interaction and points of interaction that people have. And the opportunity then we have when we are walking down the street or shopping together or riding together, commuting together, passing one another, to be aware of those moments and those opportunities to take that in and to be present of who's around us.
I've noticed in the US, it has improved. And I'll tell you, I noticed a couple of decades ago, with the coffee shop culture. And there became this habit of lots and lots of coffee shops in America now. Now, the generation above didn't have that culture, but for the 30-somethings, 15, 20 years ago, they developed a coffee shop culture. And that is a way to build relationship. So all is not lost. There are things because we're created to relate with one another. So we will find spaces.
Let's take a look at Europe again, because it's a European focus here in the Urban Podcast. In many European cities, migration churches play an important role. At least when you look at the Christian spectrum. And let's take a look at some of the strengths of these churches for arriving, for integration, but also for valuing your own cultural heritage, whatever. Please help me.
Sure.
Strength.
I think for the first generation, the need, I think it's a fundamental need to connect with people that eat the same food, speak the same language, dress the same way, because it's so hard to constantly have to translate every idea. And so it's really important for the first generation. And they don't get the affirmation. Every time they turn on the TV, there isn't a person that looks like them. Every time they walk out the door, there isn't a person that looks like them. So I think those first generation, sort of single ethnicity churches or single region churches, African churches, for example, that might have people from West Africa, East Africa, they're very important because they give those people something to hold on to during the week, that yes, we do belong somewhere. Of course, by the time the second generation comes along, they will naturally drift in a way that parents don't understand. And that drifting can be quite frightening for first generation parents, because part of their loneliness was having their children and looking into their children's faces and seeing themselves. But when their children then feel more connected to the European culture, that makes it difficult. But I was talking to an Indian pastor today, he said, I forced my children to go to Indian church. They wanted to go to the Indian International Church. Now they don't go anywhere. And so the thing is, when we talk about Jesus being water, right? Like he's refreshing and thirsting. Refreshing our thirst. We don't think about his fluidity. We don't think about the fact that water is always moving. Okay? So there's something about Christian culture that's constantly moving. And even for Europeans, it's hard because we've got solid structures of churches, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. And so we really have to look at the purpose of culture in the redeemed Christian life. Can it be fluid the way that Jesus is? Can it be refreshing and fluid and changing and adapting to the culture?
Yeah, important. When you look at the traditional churches, the churches of, I don't know, of the German ethnic groups or typical British ethnic background, whatever that is. How do you see the coexistence and the interaction between traditional churches and younger churches with these migrant churches? So that's it. What I want to say.
I'll tell you what I do think. I don't think it's out with the old and in with the new. I don't think it's a matter of move over traditional Europeans. There's no room for you here. The measure of spirituality isn't necessarily in the newness of behavior or a newness of a cultural thing. We can do and in both. And sometimes we look at our churches that have got elderly people that are set in their ways. It's not their fault that they're elderly. You're going to be there too someday. The measure of a church, the measure of the spiritual growth of a church isn't how high people raise their hands or how many tattoos they've got. The measure of spirituality is still with the traditional and the new. It's how they work together is the real measure of spirituality. Because we say on earth as it is in heaven. So the culture of heaven is expanding as the culture on earth, because the more and more people, the more and more cultures that are layered within the church, that means there are more cultures that are going to be going into heaven. And so we should never reject one for the other.
No. Do you have examples of intercultural churches?
Oh, yeah.
So churches that consciously want to bring together different nations and ethnic groups.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What we must remember is that multicolored is not multicultural. Okay.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I'll go into some church and the pastor will say, oh, yes, we're very multicultural here. But there's always a white man on the pulpit. Okay. There is the band, which might have one or two young people, one or two people of mixed ethnicities. The Africans will do a song every once in a while, and the Indians will bring some food. That's not multicultural. That's not multicultural. I remember I was speaking in a church in London at one point, and the minister, lovely minister, came to me and said, we invited all of our Indian neighbors and friends and all of the people that usually come to this church. We wanted them to come and hear you, especially because they will hear somebody like them. And he didn't realize that he could do this all the time. He could have, just as much as his congregation needed to hear him, the others need to hear people that look and sound like them. But not only that, the white people, the traditional churches, need to hear people like me too. Just like I need to hear people that are like you.
Yes.
So would you say, in terms of, you've seen that happen in terms of who's, at the pulpit, who's speaking, would it also be who's leading? Maybe not even as visible, but also actually making decisions and speaking into the decisions of the church?
Yes, indeed. Decisions will be made differently by different cultures, for sure. You can have you can have just the one person of color in the leadership team just to prove that you're not racist, or you can actually involve and have messy decisions made and be okay with it. And there are a lot of churches that will have, I saw this a lot in the US, where you can have a white church, they'll have one or two black leaders. But if it was a black-led church, most white people wouldn't go to it. Fortunately, we don't have things that way so much in the UK. And people are more apt to go to churches that are led by different ethnicities. And I think pulpit exchanges are a great idea. Get the pastor from the Nigerian church to come and speak at your church. And not on being Nigerian or being a migrant. He can speak on theology just like you can. And you go and speak in his church. And get your congregation used to listening to different ways of theologizing.
That's great.
So let's stick to that point. What are ways you have seen majority churches or leaders relate well to the migrant church? And where have they failed? But
okay, so one of the ways that majority churches are very good at doing things is they're very good at serving. They're very good at giving to poor people. Now, I put this down to the fundamental template of William Carey-style missions from the 1880s, at the height of the British Empire, that taking civilization and taking the gospel was synonymous. And so what's happened is that we still have this habit of only being able to share the gospel with people that we look down on. So we can give a little bit of medicine, we can give education, we can give food, we can give money. And I think that's one of the reasons that white people can't reach other white people, because they can't look down on them. They can't do eye to eye with academics and Wall Street people and multimillionaires. So we've got this idea that we can only, in order to reach somebody with the gospel, we've got to look down on them just a little bit. So on the one hand, the majority church is very good at serving, but on the other hand, the majority world can teach the migrant communities, the ethnic communities, can teach a lot to the majority white churches about how to raise your children, how to look after your elderly, how to always have space extra at the table. No matter who comes along, there's always enough food for one more person. And to be able to give and receive. And when you allow the migrant to give, they're not always going to be needy. They're not always going to be needy. And that's good. That's because you've done your job. So then be reciprocal. I'm not saying make it a transactional thing, but you care for people, let them care for you.
yeah, what role, Usha, do city unity networks play in dealing with each other in a more appropriate way, in a more same eye level way? Have you experienced positive examples there?
Yeah,
or
I
negative?
mean, I've seen city unity templates, and I don't find them especially useful. I think they can be one thing in a tool bag, but I don't think they're for everybody, because what works in one place doesn't work with the other. I think unity begins from the ground up. It's not that something that's imposed from above. So we can't say, hey, let's teach everybody how to play basketball and then they'll all have unity. Well, hey, it might be that you need to learn how to play cricket and not basketball.
Would be hard.
So do you see what I mean? This idea, because when you come with your template, whether you mean to or not, as the creator of the template, I will have more of me in it than I recognize.
So are you saying that each city then is unique and needs to figure that out on their own? kind of what it looks like to build unity, or that it's more from the ground up, like a grassroots type of movement that then
Yeah.
leads to a greater network? Or what do you
Yeah,
see?
I think the ground up is a lot slower, but it's a lot more authentic, and it's likely to last for many, many generations, long after the funding has run out. Right? Long after the funding has run out. These unity groups that develop organically, they stay part of each other's lives forever. They just do. I could give you examples from my own life, but it would take too long. But they will stay. Now, you can share ideas and see whether others would like to do those sort of things. But to have something organic is really allowing the Holy Spirit to do something new amongst people. It's painful and messy, but overall, I think it's worth it.
Yes, I agree. It's all about understanding God's mission, I would say, for a city and have a kingdom attitude. It's all about relationships and about trust. On the other hand, it might need some intentional strategic moves as well. Let me give you an example. You recently led a historic meeting of diverse migrant churches and ministry leaders from Oslo, Norway, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
So let us hear a little bit about that.
That was quite an extraordinary time. So the group called Norme in Oslo, which is the Norwegian Evangelical Alliance, and the Lausanne, Norway, have an annual gathering that lasts for 24 hours. And they decided that their theme would be, they would like to include migration. And so they asked me to come to Norway to speak to them about migrants. And I hesitated because I said, you have plenty of migrant Christians in Norway, and I would be using my nice British white privilege. And, I said, I just questioned how this would work. And so a wonderful man whom I deeply respect, Ole Magnus Olafsrud, suggested that I meet one or two of them and have dinner. I had done an online lecture with one Ethiopian theologian from Norway. So I thought, well, we could have lunch, maybe one or two more people. And then we came up with the idea that it would be nice for all the migrants to meet together. And one of the national leaders, the Norwegian leaders, said, well, we should come too. And I said, just a minute, let me explain to you. A lot of times when migrants are with other people, the other people's conversations overtake, because it takes a long time for a migrant to have to explain everything. So they just sit there because it's tiresome. And then when everyone leaves, the 2 or 3 migrants sit together. And that's when they have their real conversations. So I said, let's just have a migrant dinner for the migrants. And this was difficult for the Norwegians to hear, as it would be for anyone, because we're none of us racist, right? None of us are.
No, never.
So they agreed, and there are 2 or 3 observers that came, and 75 migrant leaders registered to have dinner with us.
Wow.
And we had a wonderful day, and it wasn't about attacking white people, but it was about just talking about our experiences and the values and just the wonderful things that we shared. And I have never lived in Norway. It's not like I knew what it was like to live in Norway, but we had a wonderful time, and everyone felt open. And there was a lovely 2-page spread in the newspaper and a headline that said that migrants were a gift to the Church of Norway. And I thought, yeah, actually, we are. The next day at the Norway gathering, where all the Norwegian leaders were gathered, 25 of the migrant leaders came. And they began a new way of relating to women that is still now continuing. It's not for me to direct. I don't need to go and tell them, now do this. They invite me, I send a greeting, I'll go have dinner with them sometime, sure. But they are very capable of taking it from here.
Wow. Great. Great example. Katie.
So, yeah, just along those lines, I have a question. As you're talking about these grassroots movements, and you kind of helped others approach it differently and low control, but you just, kind of helped catalyze some conversations. And what would you recommend for those leaders, those migrant church leaders that have so much to offer and have a lot of ideas and want to see God transform their city, want to be a part of that, want to be invited in, but aren't, and don't maybe have a platform like you do or connections, or aren't really known by anyone else, but yet have so much to offer? What would you recommend to them? Where do they go?
First of all, I say don't give up. Don't give up. Because we're all worshiping the same God, and it's the same Holy Spirit that convicts. And the thing with migrant churches, especially those of us who are first generation that have come from another faith background, from Hindus and Islam, we have an unquenchable passion for the gospel. So when I first became a believer, somebody told me I had a good voice, and I bought a ticket on the bus, the double-decker buses, and I sat by the driver's seat, and I sang Christian choruses at the top of my voice because I was so desperate for people to come to know Jesus, and I would just keep getting on bus after bus until the bus drivers recognized me and they would drive past me. So sometimes we might do things wrong. We make complete fools of ourselves. But our passion comes from a desire to serve. So I say to the migrant leaders, you're going to get it wrong. And it's okay. Just keep working together. Keep forgiving. Not forgetting. You forgive and you learn and you teach one another and you fall down together and you pick each other up. And it will go. It will happen. Don't let your heart get hardened. That's the hardest part for me, is that I get impatient and my heart can harden. And I really have to watch that. Yeah.
Along those lines, what's helped you in that area? Is it having others who get it? Is it just time with the Lord? What helps keep your heart soft when people are offensive, they say offensive things, they do offensive things, or they just, like all the things, the mistakes that people make and that you see over and over again? What helps you in that area?
I've spent a lot of years with a lot of bitterness and anger. A lot of years. I've spent a lot of years in denial. I'm married to a white man, so it's not like I don't know that world. But what it took was for me to speak up. And some people will shut you down. It doesn't mean you stop speaking. And some people will accuse you of things, but you need to unmute yourself. You need to speak out loud. There will be one person somewhere who will listen, and that person becomes the bridge builder. And so I would say to the majority white churches, the host country churches, listen without trying to make excuses. Sometimes you just have to carry that person's pain, and some of that, anger spills out onto you. Be okay with it. Be okay with it. Be the bridge builder. And also I would say to those people, to the migrants, study, speak, publish, knock on doors. Do it over and over and over again. Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't turn inward. Don't do that. It's really hard. Don't do it.
Thank you. Those are really good words.
Usha, when I hear you speaking, did you have role models for what you are doing now, or even what you have become now?
In one sense, I will say no, because of my people group, there's 640,000 in Britain, only 300 Christians, and I have met 200 of them. Those of my people group, my specific people group that become believers and want to serve in mission, we are always directed back to India. So I remember when I said I wanted to be a missionary when I was a child, they said, you can go to India. And I was 11. And I remember thinking, if I was white, I could go anywhere. So finding role models is hard. But on the other hand, the Bible is full of them. The Bible is full of them. I have to find them. And every time I meet people like you and your ears are open and you smile and nod and you affirm what I'm doing, it makes it that little bit easier to go on to the next and to the next and the next. So I find my role models, it's kind of like climbing up a cliff and looking for the next place to hang. And somehow people like you come along and you're another place to hang on to.
Wow. I have more questions concerning the second or even third generation of migrants. And it certainly is a very diverse group of people we are looking at here. But how do they network? Do they connect? Well, I have one example here in Berlin. It's called Berlin United. And church leaders from a lot of ethnic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds, they come together, they pray together, and they invest into relationships. They are living relationships. Maybe that's a better word. Have you experienced things like that? What are good principles to start something like that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think if it's amongst leaders, oftentimes these are quite limited to just men. So that can be quite difficult. So if you're a woman that has the type of ministry that I find myself in, teaching and things like that, those are a little bit more difficult to find. But I find them in academic places more. And incidentally, that's where I find third generation more than I find first and second. So I think the third generation are more willing to push things out a little bit further. And so there might be something that's created, let's say, for, a migrant community or an international community in one place. But for one group of people, it might have been everything and where they did most things and the most significant. But for the third generation, that might be peripheral as they start their own groups. And so there might be things like academic groups or interest groups that are not just based on getting to know each other culturally, but it might be through interests. It could be through technical things. It could be through animals or cooking or whatever. But they've still got those connections with migrating and interculturality, but the focus will be something else.
Yeah. Katie.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could go back to something you said earlier about your interest in missions and kind of the push to go back to India and just the limitations maybe that you alluded to there and the lack of encouragement. And now fast forward, you're involved in sending and in missionary training. Can you tell us more about that and what that looks like today and the opportunities that you're involved in and helping to provide for people?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I could never go back to India because I wasn't from India in the first place, because I was born here in Britain. And so that's a thing that people kind of, it's like, if you're a woman in ministry, is the first thing you're going to talk about is that being a woman. And it might be to start off with Indian stuff. But for me, having access, I would say this to anybody, having access to a first generation Christ follower from another background is a wealth of information. So I feel that when I meet people who want to minister to Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs, there is a way that I relate to them that's not from a training manual. And so, and I think I've probably overemphasized this, but honestly, I think a lot of training is from people just being with me. But hang with me for 2 or 3 weeks. Hang with me for 2 or 3 weeks. I don't have any answers. I don't have a template for you. But I'll get to know what kind of person you are, and you'll get to know what kind of person I am. And in that, I mean, it's not cost effective because I can't teach 50 people. It's not like 50 people can move into my little basement room here. But the capacity to be able to see beyond the Westernness to what's deeper, the cultural root that's in me, it takes a living with me in order to do. Like some people, I make Indian food, and some people will say, well, can you send me the recipe? And I can't, because you have to stand with me and see how I pinch and poke and this and that and that. I don't even know the English names of the spices, even though I've never lived in India. And so on the one hand, we've got our mission agencies and things saying, okay, train us and do this, and right, give us a training program. And somebody will come along and say, okay, you do this training program and you'll always be able to reach Muslims, and nothing happens. You spend a fortune on another one and nothing happens. Because there is, it's like Jesus finding the disciples where they were, and they walked with him and he walked with them. And if we're walking alongside each other, the first generation Christ follower loves to tell others about Jesus. Hang out with first generation. That would be my thing. I don't even know how to make that into a training thing. I had no idea when I was going to Norway. When I went on that plane to Oslo, I went to have dinner at a Chinese church with some migrant people. I had no idea what was going to happen the rest of the day, the next day, or what has happened since.
Yeah.
I had no idea. So it had to be the Holy Spirit, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's great. Wow. Wow, I just have to say I appreciate your insight and just taking us back to the work of God. And there's such a temptation to want to find the formula or want to find the one book or resource that will help us, and just that taking us back to discipleship and following Jesus and how he walked and how he lived and the power of doing things together. So as you think about what you're involved in and what you'd like to see God do, what kind of encouragement or thoughts do you have for us today, for those listening to this podcast, in various cities, just wanting to see God work, wanting to do things differently maybe than they have in the past, open to doing things differently. I hear you pushing us to just learn from one another, relationships, but what do you see? What do you want God to do as we work together and learn from one another? What do you hope comes from that?
I think the idea that we have to be experts is probably the biggest myth. And so I think coming humbly to the throne of grace, hand in hand with one another, is perhaps the thing. And I hate to say this, but I still think it goes back to that 1880s model of us being culturally superior. And when you always feel that you could be better or you should be better or somebody can teach you or there's some method that makes you an expert, that's when things become difficult. So rely less on, and I'm not saying that we should never have any training or teaching or anything like that, but rely on the presence of God that's in you, to look for the image of God in the other. I think we can all start there. That doesn't take any amount of education, calling, expertise, theology, degrees, calling, ordination. Just, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but you could go from there to as far as you want to. Go all the way to doing PhDs, postdocs, whatever you want to. But there is a place for everyone from that, looking at somebody as the image of God, all the way to the highest level of education that you want. And find your place in it. Find your place in it.
Usha, thanks. We are approaching the end of the podcast of this episode, and one final question: was there any experience recently which really gave you hope?
I think the Norway, the time in Oslo, gave me an incredible amount of hope. And I will also say that my current involvement with Lausanne Europe and sharing the role of regional director, and it's not so much that I have a leadership role, but I'm in a position to listen to people from over 40 countries and listen to their challenges and listen to their highlights and learn from them. So I think that's probably the most.
Great. Usha, can you very briefly explain the Lausanne Europe movement? Because there might be listeners who don't know it.
Sure. Lausanne International began some 50 years ago with Billy Graham and John Scott, who combined missiology and research in academia, and probably the largest network of evangelical Christians around the world. And over time, it's grown exponentially. And just for sake of ability to work together, the world is divided into regions, and 12 regions, and Europe is one of them. And I believe that there's an authentic way that God is doing things in Europe. Is not just one way of doing things that's a kingdom culture that's flat out everywhere. And so within Europe, we have more nations than any other region. We have a massive percentage of people movement, migration, both from the majority world and within Europe. And so through Lausanne, we connect with other evangelical Christians, church planters, leaders, denominational leaders, ministry leaders, to work together, to pray together, to fellowship together, to network together, to look at ways that we can share the gospel better. And the one saying I love about Lausanne is Lausanne's not a denomination. It's not a paid membership. Is that Lausanne fruit grows best on other people's trees. What I love to do is to sow into Europe and see the nations of Europe blessed. That's why I love being part of Lausanne.
Good. Katie.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Usha, and sharing and answering our random questions and just sharing from your experience and your wisdom. And we just really appreciate that. And that's all we have for today on the Urban Hope podcast. You will find this and future episodes on our website at www.urbanhope.edu. And every 2 months, we also offer an online conversation with European urban leaders. And you can sign up for that on our website and get the link for that forum. And the Urban Hope podcast is a production of the Europe Evangelical Alliance, Cities Network, and the Berlin Institute for Urban Theology. We're partnering with other networks like City to City Europe, Kairos, and City Changers. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Usha. And until our next episode, stay hopeful.
Thank you.